One slap. That's all it took to shatter a life, and shake an entire police department to its core. On a quiet street in Silverest Grove, a decorated black woman named Danielle Cooper, dressed in jogging gear, is stopped, humiliated, and violently arrested by Officer Brian Reynolds, who has no idea that the woman he just slapped is his ultimate boss. What follows is a jaw-dropping unraveling of power, race, and revenge. Danielle isn't just a jogger, she's the chief inspector of the National Ethics Bureau. When video footage of the incident goes viral, Reynolds' career implodes. But the story doesn't end there. As Danielle rises to become a national icon for justice, Reynolds descends into obsession, stalking her and plotting a violent attack that ends with a SWAT raid, and a chilling courtroom showdown. Want to know how it all ends? Stick with us to the very last second. And if stories of truth, justice, and unexpected twists inspire you, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. The morning air was crisp and quiet as Danielle Cooper jogged along the neatly paved sidewalks of Silverest Grove, a gated suburban neighborhood known more for its manicured lawns than its diversity. Dressed in gray Nike running shoes and a navy Under Armour zip-up, she moved with steady rhythm, her earbuds playing soft jazz as the sun peeked over the rooftops. It should have been a peaceful start to her day. But that illusion shattered when the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car blocked her path. Officer Brian Reynolds, a seasoned cop with a hardened jaw and narrow eyes, stepped out with a swagger that oozed entitlement. To him, Danielle didn't fit the neighborhood's image. She didn't belong, not because of anything she did, but simply because of who she was. He didn't ask for ID with courtesy. He barked orders. When she calmly asked why she was being stopped, he grew more agitated. His authority, long unchecked, didn't know how to handle composure from someone he assumed would be submissive. With people beginning to gather, phones held up and recording, the situation escalated. Danielle didn't shout. She didn't resist. She simply stood tall, her chin raised, her voice clear. "Are you stopping me just because I'm jogging while black in this neighborhood?" The question struck like lightning. Brian's face flushed. Then, in a moment of blind rage, he raised his hand, and slapped her. Gasps echoed from the bystanders. Someone screamed, "I got it on video." But Brian, too far gone, didn't stop. He grabbed her wrist and shoved her into cuffs right there on the street. "You think you can talk back to me?" he growled. Danielle didn't flinch. "You just destroyed your career," she said, her eyes locked on his. The videos hit social media within minutes. The image of a black woman in handcuffs, slapped in broad daylight for simply jogging, ignited a firestorm across the country. But what made jaws drop wasn't just the brutality, it was the reveal that followed. Danielle Cooper wasn't just anyone. She was Chief Inspector of the National Ethics Bureau, one of the highest-ranking officials in the justice system, a woman who had spent her career rooting out corruption and abuse of power in law enforcement. Now, she had become the victim of the very injustice she'd spent decades fighting. As Officer Reynolds marched her into the precinct, he was still oblivious. But moments later, his world collapsed when his captain showed him the video and said the words that would haunt him forever: "You just handcuffed your boss." And that's only the beginning. If you're hooked already, keep watching. The story of Danielle Cooper takes twists you won't see coming, from smear campaigns to a chilling home invasion. Trust us, you'll want to hear how it all ends. And don't forget to subscribe, drop a comment, and join us for more stories that expose truth and stir the soul. As Danielle Cooper sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists tightly bound by the cold steel of the handcuffs, she didn't panic. She didn't cry. Her breathing remained slow, her face unreadable. Outside, voices of outrage grew louder, people demanding her release, cameras still rolling. But inside the cruiser, Danielle's mind wasn't on the flashing lights or the rising fury. It was drifting, 25 years into the past, to the moment everything changed. She was 10 years old, growing up in the sun-scorched neighborhood of Southbrook. The sidewalks were cracked, the streetlights flickered at night, and the houses leaned with age. It was a place full of heart but lacking in justice. On one ordinary summer day, she had watched her father, Samuel Cooper, handcuffed on his own front porch, accused of obstructing justice for simply questioning why officers were roughing up a neighbor. Danielle had tried to run to him, only to be shoved to the pavement by an officer twice her size. Her knees scraped and bleeding, she watched her father get dragged away, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet pain she didn't understand, until much later. That moment branded itself onto her soul. It was the day she realized that justice wasn't handed out equally. That some voices were silenced before they ever spoke. But Danielle wasn't going to stay silent. She made herself a promise: she would never be powerless again. She grew up with that fire in her chest. While other kids played after school, she buried herself in books on civil rights, court rulings, and the history of American law enforcement. By 16, she was already tutoring her teachers in constitutional law. She went on to attend Howard University, then Yale Law School on full scholarship, defying every statistic that had once defined her zip code. People underestimated her. Let them. It only made her stronger. Danielle joined the Department of Justice in her late 20s, quickly earning a reputation as a sharp, fearless investigator. She dismantled money laundering schemes, exposed unethical judges, and testified before Congress on reforming internal police oversight. Her career was built on holding the powerful accountable. She never compromised her ethics, no matter the pressure, no matter the threats. That's how she rose to become Chief Inspector of the National Ethics Bureau, a position she earned not through favors, but through relentless, often lonely, hard work. So when Officer Reynolds slapped her and shoved her into the back of a patrol car, he didn't just violate a citizen, he awakened a storm that had been building for decades. Danielle wasn't just going to walk away from this. She was going to shine a light so bright, the entire country would have to look. And that's exactly what she did. If you've made it this far, stay with us, because the story is just beginning. Danielle's rise from that patrol car to a national reckoning will leave you breathless. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for the next gripping chapter. By the time Officer Brian Reynolds marched Danielle Cooper through the doors of the Silverest Grove precinct, the video of her unlawful arrest had already swept across the internet like wildfire. Within just 1 hour, hashtags like #JusticeForDanielle and #EndPoliceAbuse were trending nationally. From New York to Los Angeles, people weren't just outraged, they were activated. What began as a bystander's phone recording had become a cultural lightning rod, reigniting the national conversation around race, power, and policing in America. But Brian remained oblivious. As he shoved Danielle toward holding, his grip tight on her arm, he still believed he had the upper hand. He thought he'd taught a mouthy woman a lesson. What he didn't realize was that his entire career, his entire identity, was unraveling in real time. Just before Danielle could be processed, the precinct's intercom cracked with a sharp, commanding voice: "Do not place her in holding. Bring her to a private room. No one is to touch her." The room froze. Officers turned toward the source. Standing at the far end of the hall was Captain Vanessa Dawson, the highest-ranking officer in the district. Her face was stone cold. In her hand was a tablet, playing the video that had already garnered millions of views. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Officer Reynolds," she said, never breaking eye contact. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian's smirk faded, his posture wilted. He tried to explain, but Vanessa cut him off. "Do you even know who you just arrested?" she asked. Murmurs rippled through the room as Danielle stood tall, her wrists still red from the cuffs, her eyes calm and resolute. "She is the Chief Inspector of the National Ethics Bureau," Vanessa continued. "Your boss. And mine." Gasps filled the room. Officers who had once joked with Brian now turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Danielle simply held out her hands. "Take them off," she said, referring to the handcuffs. A rookie officer scrambled forward, his hands shaking as he unlocked the restraints. The heavy clink of metal hitting the floor felt like a gavel slamming down in court. The fallout was swift. News outlets seized the story, flashing headlines across every screen in the country. Top federal ethics officer assaulted by local cop. Police brutality caught on camera, again. Systemic racism meets its reckoning. Protests erupted outside the precinct. Hundreds gathered with signs reading, "We stand with Danielle," and "No justice, no peace." Public officials were forced to respond. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Police departments across the nation began reviewing their internal conduct procedures. Danielle hadn't just become a victim. She had become a catalyst. And yet, while the country rallied behind her, Danielle knew this wasn't about one slap. This was about a much deeper wound. And she wasn't done fighting. Stick around. Because the next chapter will take you inside the mind of a man consumed by downfall, and a woman who refused to be broken. Like, comment, and subscribe to follow this powerful journey of reckoning, resilience, and justice. While the nation rallied behind Danielle Cooper, calling for police reform and demanding accountability, Brian Reynolds sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, watching his life crumble piece by piece. His suspension had turned into public disgrace. His badge, his reputation, his identity as a respected officer, all gone in a matter of hours. Every news channel ran the same footage, Danielle's calm defiance, his violent slap, and his walk of shame through the precinct halls. Social media had turned him into a villain, a cautionary tale. But instead of reflection, Brian chose resentment. In his mind, Danielle hadn't been a victim, she was the reason for his fall. He blamed her for everything, the viral videos, the protests, the headlines. He refused to accept the truth, that it was his own unchecked rage and prejudice that had cost him everything. And in that denial, a new obsession began to take hold. He started small, Googling Danielle's name, reading every article, watching her interviews. Then he moved deeper, keeping tabs on her public schedule, noting where she spoke, who she appeared with, and what she said. Danielle's star was rising. She was invited to speak before congressional panels, featured in 60 Minutes, and hailed by major newspapers as a new voice for justice in America. Every accolade drove Brian further into bitterness. Late one night, in the corner of a seedy bar far from Silverest Grove, Brian was approached by a man who knew exactly who he was, and what he wanted. He called himself Miller, and he came with a proposition. "You want her to pay," Miller said, sliding a worn envelope across the table. "I can help you make that happen." Inside the envelope were names, numbers, and connections, information about Naomi's past, her former cases, even people who had once worked with her but had since left the public eye. Brian hesitated, but the hate in his heart overpowered any sense of caution. He accepted the offer. Together, they began a calculated smear campaign. Brian hired a private investigator with no questions asked and paid him in cash to dig into Danielle's personal and professional history. The goal wasn't to uncover truth, but to manufacture doubt. Within days, anonymous blogs began posting exposés about Danielle's supposed ethical violations. They accused her of hiding evidence in old investigations, colluding with political figures, and taking bribes, none of it true, but all written with just enough ambiguity to spark public suspicion. Low-level news sites picked it up. Then social media ran wild. The phrase, "where there's smoke, there's fire," began appearing in comment sections across the web. Danielle, who had spent her entire career building a reputation for integrity, now found herself under siege, not from the system she had challenged, but from lies weaponized to destroy her name. But what Brian didn't realize was that Danielle Cooper had faced darkness before. She had outsmarted real corruption, survived real threats, and walked through fire to get where she was. And she wasn't about to let a disgraced ex-cop take it all away. Keep watching, because in the next chapter, Danielle fights back. And this time, she's not alone. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. It started with an envelope on her doorstep. No postage, no return address, just her name, handwritten in black ink. Danielle Cooper had received angry letters before, threats from those who hated what she stood for. But this was different. Inside were photographs, one of her leaving her office, another of her chatting with a colleague at a local cafe, and a third, far more chilling, showing her at a weekend picnic with her 12-year-old son, Isaiah. Beneath each photo, a single line was scrawled in cold, block letters, "Be careful. We are watching." Danielle felt a chill run through her. This wasn't some troll online or a faceless critic behind a keyboard. This was real. This was someone who had followed her. Someone who had watched her child. She didn't panic, but she did act. She upgraded her home security system, alerted her team, and quietly notified local authorities. But the letters didn't stop. They began showing up in her office mailbox, slipped under her windshield wiper, and even once taped to the gate outside her home. Each one more personal, more invasive. One letter included a photo taken outside Isaiah's school, with the caption, "You're not the only one who can lose everything." Danielle knew exactly who was behind it. She didn't have direct evidence, yet, but she recognized the signs of someone spiraling out of control. Brian Reynolds was unraveling, and now he was becoming dangerous. What Brian didn't know, however, was that Danielle had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She wasn't just a victim of threats, she had once worked undercover, exposed organized corruption rings, and dismantled networks that thrived in the shadows. She began documenting every letter, every photo, every suspicious vehicle parked near her home. She looped in her most trusted contacts in federal law enforcement, all off the record. Quietly, methodically, Danielle built a case. But Brian wasn't finished. One rainy night, parked just down the street from Danielle's house, he sat in his beat-up sedan with a baseball bat in the trunk and a bottle of whiskey at his side. Soaked in liquor and rage, he stared at the warm glow of her living room window, muttering to himself. "She took everything from me. She thinks she's untouchable." His hands trembled, not from fear, but from obsession. And this time, he wasn't alone. With the help of Miller and a few hired criminals, Brian had devised a terrifying plan. He'd spent weeks hacking into Danielle's home security system, learning her routines, identifying her blind spots. And now, under the cover of darkness and pouring rain, they approached her back door. But Danielle wasn't sleeping. She had deliberately left a decoy phone on the table, screen glowing. Her real phone, hidden in her jacket pocket, was sending silent distress signals to a federal task force on standby. As she stepped inside her house that night, something in the air told her to stay alert. And when Brian emerged from the shadows, weapon in hand, Danielle stood her ground, not as a victim, but as a woman ready to end the nightmare. Keep watching, because the next moment will take your breath away. The storm is coming to a head, and justice is about to strike back. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you're here when it all unfolds. The moment Brian Reynolds stepped through Danielle Cooper's back door, everything changed. Rain pounded the roof. The house was dimly lit, quiet, almost too quiet. Danielle stood in her living room, facing him. Her eyes were calm, but sharp, measuring, reading every inch of him. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't even blink. Behind Brian, 3 masked men slipped inside, hired thugs ready to do damage. Brian held a handgun, his hands shaking as badly as his voice. "You ruined my life," he spat, his eyes bloodshot from anger and alcohol. "Now it's your turn." Danielle took one slow breath and didn't move. "You're not thinking clearly, Brian. This isn't going to go the way you think." That's when he snapped. He lunged forward, yelling incoherently, the gun pointed squarely at her. But Danielle had already taken a calculated risk. She wasn't just hoping for help, she had orchestrated it. The hidden phone in her jacket had been transmitting live location data for the past 20 minutes. Her federal task force team had been watching in real time. And just as Brian's finger twitched on the trigger, the front window shattered with a thunderous crash. Flashbangs lit the room in a strobe of white.